Hello everyone, welcome to this, sorry, I'm having a technical problem here. Welcome to this webinar on storytelling for change with Shawn Callahan. As some of you will have remembered, we tried to have this a couple of weeks ago and we got interrupted by a fire alarm and a building evacuation. So thanks very much for coming back, and we're really pleased that Shawn was able to come again so quickly to share his ideas with you. Shawn is the author of Putting Stories to Work. Those of you who have taken part in leadership, you'll know that the idea of storytelling, envisioning the future, and being able to communicate with people is a really key component of leadership. And so it's really good to have Shawn here to put a very practical spin on this idea of storytelling for change. I'll hand over to you. Thanks. And we'll try and sort out the technical echo.
Yeah, that's right. That's our level of difficulty for the day. Hey, it's great to be here, and I guess what I wanted to do was just give some ideas on how you can use some storytelling techniques to facilitate the whole change process. Change programs typically quite difficult. Lots of challenges that are always you're facing. So how do you tackle some of those challenges using story techniques? For me, I got into this in a kind of peculiar way because I was working for IBM back in the 90s, and we ended up being part of this really interesting research centre called the Klein Centre for Organisational Complexity. And in that research centre, what we did was we looked at complexity theory and how we could use that to change organisations. And we came to the conclusion that, when something's complex and messy and there was no right answer, it was actually better to try to work out the patterns that were going on, seeking out and, if you like, reinforcing the patterns that worked and then disrupting the patterns that didn't work. And we sort of said, well, how do you find these patterns? How do you work out what the patterns are in an organisation? Patterns of behaviour, I should say. And we came to the conclusion that it was really about finding the stories that are being told. And we had this idea that if you wanted to change a culture, you needed to change the stories that were being told. So with that in mind, we started to learn about anthropological techniques and ethnography, and we would go into large organisations and we would collect stories, hundreds and hundreds of stories, and then we would take those stories, and they were, small anecdotes. These are small things that people talk about. It's not the big, dramatic stories, but just small things that happened last week, for example. And then what we'd do is we'd get a whole group of people together in the organisation, key stakeholders, and then they would work through a process where they worked out their own patterns and then decided which initiatives they would put in place to reinforce the ones that were working for them and disrupt the ones that weren't. And I know one of the things I always find was so interesting about that work is that people came up with initiatives that they wouldn't come up with if they went through a logical, rational process. For example, we were doing this project for a library. This library was moving from their old building to the new building, and they decided, look, this is a great time to look at behaviour and culture. And so we went and collected a whole bunch of stories of leadership behaviour from the library, got all the employees together, and we had, I don't know, probably a couple of hundred stories on the walls. And then I remember this one wall that was full of stories, had lots of post-it notes over it. And I said to the people looking at that wall, so what patterns do you see? And what was interesting is they looked at it and their first gut response was, oh, we need new training. Training was going to be the answer to this thing. I looked at it and I went, oh, I don't think it's training. But of course, you can't say anything. As a facilitator, you can't say anything, otherwise it becomes your problem and not theirs. So I'm quiet and I sort of eventually say, look, why don't you tell the story of what you see? So anyway, they went away and I gave them a simple story structure. I sort of said, use a spine that looks like this. In the past, it was like this, and then something changed, and as a result of that, we did this, and then we did that, and this is the moral of the story, a very basic sort of story spine. And anyway, this group went away and they came back and they had this story about this woman, we'll call her Sarah. And Sarah had been in the organisation for some time and she had a terrible habit of bitching about other people. and she would bitch about her colleagues, and she would bitch about the leadership, and anyway, this went on for a number of years, and then one day a new fellow arrives, very well credentialed. He gets into the work, and next thing you know, this woman Sarah is bitching about this new guy, and then all the other employees start bitching about Sarah. Anyway, one day she goes out for lunch, she steps off the curb, and she gets run over and killed by a BMW. Now, the last bit wasn't true, right? But they just threw this in as part of their story. I don't know why, but it was. But what was interesting, it sounds kind of a bit funny to us when we hear this story, but for them, they were really like emotional about telling this story, right? Anyway, they look at each other and they say, look, we don't have a training problem. We have a bitching problem, right? And there and then, they all agreed that that was the thing that they were going to really tackle. And I would bet, I would be willing to bet up $10 that they wouldn't have come up with that answer if they'd gone through a logical, rational, let's do the analysis of the culture type approach. So the stories just sort of bring out another perspective. But if you like, for change generally, I wanted to give you sort of a broad framework, and then sort of we'll dive into one area. And the sort of broad framework I'm thinking of sort of sharing with you is just this idea of the 3 ways in which you can use story in any sort of change program. At the top, it's really about telling the big story of the change, right? Your strategy, your change strategy. And for me, again, it's using a very basic structure. I like just using that structure of, in the past we were like this, and then something happened, and as a result of that, that's why we have to do this change, so that in the future, it's going to be like this. And the key thing there, and it's a bit like the work I was telling you about with the library, you want to get the employees, the people in your organisation to work out that story, right? And do it together. I've literally had 100 people in a room all working out their change strategy. And the way I like to do it is I get them in small tables. They all come up with their own version of the story. And then it's sort of like, it's almost like they're competing against each other to see which story is the best. And then we take, bits out of this story and bits out of that story, and eventually up on the wall, the bigger story emerges. And the great thing about it is that now they own it, right? It's their story. And then they go out and promulgate that out into the organisation. Then there's another element, that's kind of like the top-down bit, right? And everyone does that sort of top-down bit, I think. But what's probably more important is the bottom-up bit. And for me, that's this circle on the right-hand side, your company's ability to find and share relevant stories. And to me, it's about embedding storytelling. Some companies do this particularly well. I mean, the one that always springs to mind for me is the Apple stores, Apple retail stores. When you go, say you walk past one of those Apple stores before they open in the morning, you'll see the blue uniforms kind of huddled together, and they're having their conversation, their morning huddle. A very American thing, having huddles. But anyway, they're huddling together, and one of the things that they're going through is a little exercise where the previous day they'd had run a net promoter score. And this net promoter score, then the next day, so someone will get a score out of 10 as to how good their customer service was. Anyway, the next day, if someone gets a 10 out of 10, the manager in that huddle says, John, you got a 10 out of 10 yesterday. Well done. And everyone claps. And then he says, hey, John, you remember that guy came in from the Dandenongs, had the mini iPad problem? Why don't you tell everyone what happened, right? And of course, what does he do? He tells a story. And everyone listens to that story. Of course, storytelling, by the way, is not mentioned. And this is a key factor. I'll tell you more about this later. Anyway, he tells a story. And at the end, the manager says, well done, John, that's great. And then everyone who hears that knows in a very concrete and tangible way what it takes to get a 10 out of 10 in customer service. Now, they don't have, posters up on the wall of inspirational quotes and people rowing together or, sort of geese flying in formation or any of that sort of stuff. What they have is just story after story every day of all the different machinations of what it takes to give good customer service. So they're seeing it modelled, right? So to me, that's a really important element. How do you put some systematic processes in place that allow stories to be told on a very regular basis. But the area I want to focus on is actually this third area. That's really around, the leadership's ability to find and tell stories. And it's interesting. I was in Canberra yesterday and working with one of the government departments there. And it's really interesting listening to people who've never done this before, where it's so different and surprising to them. You can sort of see that they all of a sudden realise that they do tell stories, and everyone's telling stories around them. But when they go to practice, they tell them at this really high level, right? They sort of tell these, it's almost like they want to be separated from their stories. It's like a bit dangerous, perhaps. They feel, that it's a bit dangerous. But what you do is once you get them to hear those stories, the job really is getting them to get into these moments, into these very specific instances, because stories are not about words, right? This is the mistake people make. People think stories are about words. Good stories are about pictures, right? So, when I was telling you about the Apple huddle, could you see that actual huddle happening, right? Could you see John there, telling his story? That's the level at which you tell stories, because it turns out humans are great at abstracting. We'll take a very specific instance and we'll go, bam, we'll make that into a major principle. However, we're hopeless at taking an abstraction and going down into the detail and working out what the detail means. And it's why we, whenever people are confused, they'll say things like, can you give me an example? I'd like to hear an example. They're looking for the stories, right? So this is just a few ideas on how you can help your leaders find and tell their stories. With these sort of things, I like to have some sort of process. I find a lot of people who talk about storytelling sort of just talk at a sort of generic level of, here it's good to tell stories. Stories are memorable, and here's some examples. I'd rather us jump into the detail of, what are the various processes that we have to cover off on, and then sort of look at some of the detail underneath that. So the process here is this very simple one. You've got to discover your stories. That's about noticing and getting out there and finding them. You have to have some way to remember your stories, because really today I'm focused on oral storytelling, which means telling stories off the top of your, what is it? Off the top of your head. I was off your cuff. I was getting the two mixed up there. And so you got to remember those stories. Then, of course, there's different ways to share stories and different types of stories to share. And then finally, who wants to hear someone tell the same stories over and over again? You've got to know when to refresh the stories. And I've come across some leaders who are really good at that, actually. I'm doing some work for an insurance company, and the CEO is one of the best storytellers I've come across. And what he does is that, like the previous week, he'll be out talking to his people, and he'll be out. He's really good at getting the coalface. He wants to go and talk to people at the call centres and things like that. And so he'll find a story from the previous week which has a key principle that he wants to reinforce, and he'll tell that story the next week. And then the following week, you'll find another story with the same principle that he'll tell the week after. So his stories are always new, but it's the same message. It's a phenomenal capability if you can build it up. So anyway, that's the process. So let's jump in and see what we can uncover. The first thing I'd like to say about discovery is I think this only becomes effective when it becomes a habit, right? When in the way in which leaders communicate, they're peppering what they're saying with anecdotes and various stories. And they say habits are formed through a very simple process. And the simple process is, first of all, you have to have a trigger to remind you to do the activity. So, with brushing your teeth, you walk into the bathroom, that's your trigger. You go, oh, got to brush my teeth. The second thing is you do the activity, brush your teeth, but then you have to get a reward for it. Now, companies like Palmolive and others have worked out that what we really love is a minty taste and froth, right? Now, you don't actually need that froth and bubble in your toothpaste to make it work, but they've worked out that that's actually an effective way for you to get a bit addicted to the process, right? So that's their habit that they've helped us create. Well, that's the reward. In storytelling, the approach is a little bit more like when you catch yourself being really opinionated, right? when you're being very forthright and you're giving your viewpoint on something. You're saying, look, customer service, it's all about attention to their experience or something like that. You hear people say those sort of phrases. And that's when you have to say, okay, what's an example? What do I mean by that? What's something that illustrates it? So you've got to catch yourself doing that first. Then you share your story, the specific moment that illustrates what you're talking about. And then the reward is actually the response you get from the audience. The great thing about oral storytelling is it's a two-way thing. It's not just you telling a story. It's a back and forwards that's happening. And so you're getting this instant feedback. So think about the times where you're standing up in front of, especially, you're in a group and you're being opinionated, giving your viewpoint. Just think, okay, what is the story? Now, as it turns out, you won't have one to start with. It'd be great to think, oh, bam, you have a story. But more often than not, you won't even have anything. That's why you have to then think about discovery. So let's jump into this discovery side of things. I think for me, I want to just make it very clear what type of storytelling I'm on about. I like to think of it as a bit of a spectrum. One end of the spectrum, I call it big S storytelling. And to me, that's what Hollywood does. It's drama. It's what screenwriters do and authors. They know about beautiful plot structures and character development and denouements and all that cool stuff that makes great storytelling. Advertising agencies, I think, in that space as well. Whereas we're down the other end of the spectrum. We're in what I call small S storytelling. One of the beauties of doing that work at IBM and going in and just collecting people's stories, you find that the stories they tell in organizations are tiny little things. They're not fully formed, beautiful stories. And it turns out you don't have to tell great stories. Excuse me. You just have to tell a story, right? Mind you, you have to have a point. People have to at least hear it and go, oh, I get what you mean. But you don't have to have anything like the big S storytelling end. Now, you can go up that spectrum towards big S storytelling. You can learn things from that end a little bit, but you never want to go too far because you end up doing things like, one of the big mistakes I see is people fall in love with storytelling and then they start to perform their stories, right? So, there'll be a leader standing in front of a group of people and they'll be sort of talking about the quarterly review or whatever, and then they've got this story they want to tell. And they get to the story bit and all of a sudden their voice changes. They go, and then 3 years ago, and they next thing they're acting out. Of course, you can't see me doing that, but I'm acting out. I'm acting out the story. So that, I guess, so we got to be careful. You want to go up towards big S a little bit to learn from it, but you never want to go too far. You never want to sort of start doing things like acting out those stories.
Can I just ask there, is that about authenticity, to use another awful word? Is that about being real and the message resonating because people understand that that's where it's coming from?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Because we've got this very fine-tuned radar of what's normal, right? And so the leader's talking normally and he's filling things in, and then all of a sudden it's changed somehow. And all of us, and when and people's alert systems go up when something changes, and as a result of that, they're not really hearing your message. They're just focusing on the way you're presenting or the sort of style. So you're losing that opportunity. Yeah. So definitely, it's really about that authenticity and just sharing, keeping it conversational. Yeah. Now, this little thing I need to share with you is about spotting stories, and this is like the foundation for discovery. And I have to say, this is a little bit of a curse as well as a blessing, right? Because from here on in, once you have this framework in your mind, you'll see stories everywhere. And, you'll be watching someone present and you'll be going, oh, there's a story. Then there'll be a period where there's no stories and you go, oh, that's a bit boring. And there's another story. And literally, they're all around you, right? We're all telling stories. So that'll drive you a little bit nuts. But at the same time, you can't really do this work until you can say what's a story and what's not. And I must admit, I get a little bit frustrated because a lot of people are talking about storytelling at the moment, but they're not telling stories. right? You know, they'll say, oh, stories are really important. What's the story of our brand? What's the story of our company, our product? You know, I've had a CEO say to me that, you know, he's the storyteller. That's what he does. He tells the story of the company. And then when I asked him, he just sort of spoke for 10 minutes in the sort of way of, you know, we've had year-on-year growth, and we're leaders in our market, and, you know, we have industry penetration, and, you know, talk like that for 10 minutes, and then looked at me at the end like, nailed it, you know, like, that's our story. And I had to say, look, I don't want to be disrespectful, but I mean, it's all interesting information, but it's not a story. And here's the thing, you don't get the benefits of storytelling unless you're telling a story. Right? You don't get all those memory benefits, the emotional benefits, the connection benefits. All those great things don't happen unless you're sharing a story. So here it is. The first thing is that you're looking out for a time marker. So if someone says, oh, just the other day, or on Tuesday, or they'll give you a vague one. They'll say, oh, yeah, a while back, you know, we had this change in our organisation. A while back is another time marker. And when you hear a time marker, you're nearly almost guaranteed to hear a story. Of course, you know, the classic fairy tale time marker is, you know, once upon a time. But again, that doesn't work so well in business, I find. But in addition, if it's not a time marker, it's a place marker. And, you know, people say things like, oh yeah, no, I was in the boardroom and Peter walked in, right? You know, that's the beginning of a story, right? So first of all, time and place. Stories happen in a time and place. And you've got to tune your ear for this. As soon as you start tuning your ear, that's the bit where you start to see it all over the place. Second thing is that stories are just a recounting of events. You know, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Actually, the guys from South Park, Trey Parker and his colleague, I can't remember. Matt Stone, thank you. They put their finger on it really nicely here in terms of events. They say that when they're looking at their storyboard and they're looking at each scene, if the inferred word between the scenes is and, they throw it away, because it ends up, they know that's a boring story. If you say this happened and then this happened and then this happened and then this happened, no one's interested. They said the two words that they like are but and therefore, right? This happened, but then this happened, therefore this happened, but this happened. And they find if you have that, it's really this idea that stories have shapes. You know, you want to have ups and downs. If you want to find a cool little video of stories having shapes, do a Google of Kurt Vonnegut's lecture on stories and shapes, right? It's funny, but it really illustrates, you know, what this really means, right? Anyway, so you're listening out for events. The next thing you're listening out for is people. Stories have people in them. Well, more broadly, they have characters, but in our case, you know, in business storytelling, we're talking about people. And dialogue, when you hear dialogue, and by the way, we do dialogue all the time. It's like so natural for us in our conversation. We'll say things like, oh yeah, I was chatting to David yesterday. You know what he said? And then we'll do the David dialogue, right? The thing about it is that you actually can't give dialogue unless it's inside a story. That's the only way in which we can deliver dialogue. It's why songs use it so much, right? As the sort of core. It's almost like the most intimate way of getting so close to a story and what's happening. It's actually you watch the dialogue and listen to the dialogue. So anyway, these are the three main elements. So imagine if I told you this, and you tell me, you know, you're listening there to this, you tell me whether you think this is a story, right? So I got up early this morning and had my breakfast, got myself organised, and I came into Melbourne University ready for this webinar. What do you reckon? I've got shakes of the heads here in the room. No, it doesn't quite. If it is, it's the worst story in the world, right? And it's because a story has to have something unanticipated, right? Something when you hear it, you go, oh, you know, it doesn't have to be mind-blowing, or you don't have to be going, wow, that's amazing. You just have to go, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, that's interesting. That's a different, you know, I didn't realise that was going to happen. And so the reason why I like this as a sort of a way of spotting stories, it gets away from that whole hero's journey thing that so many people have fallen in love with, but only works really in that Hollywood space, right? And they start defining stories like this. They'll say, oh, a story is when a hero faces a challenge and overcomes that challenge. That's a story. Well, sorry, how do you explain coincidence stories, right? Which we love, but it hasn't got a hero. It doesn't have anything all that amazing in it. We hear them and we go, oh my God, really? Those two people met? That's crazy. You know, in the middle of the Nullarbor, you know, in that 1:30 seconds or whatever it might be. So that helps us spot just stories. To be a business story, it has to have a point, right? And I guess that's a fundamental component which is sometimes forgotten. Okay. Story journaling, I think, is a great way to start to build up your repertoire. So, you know, every day, just get into that habit of jotting down the things that were remarkable. They could be stories that you heard, but it might be just something that happened to you that was remarkable. So, you know, yesterday, I was able to tell you something about my experience with the government department yesterday. You know, something remarkable happened. You just notice it and you go, oh, okay. You might even not even think of it as a story at the time, but if you get into this habit of a story journal, it starts to coalesce into these little chunks that you then can retell when you attach a business point to them. No? And the other thing, and if you go to our website, anecdote.com, you can get this free ebook which has 170 questions that just help you find stories. We find that you know, you kind of just need prompters to try to help you find it. So if you go there, you'll be able to grab a copy of that. It's just a PDF. Okay, remembering. So stories are definitely memorable. The research shows they're about 7 times more memorable than facts alone. Which is phenomenal when you think about it, 7 times. But I wanted to give you a little illustration of this. I'm just going to read out this list. So John walked on the roof, Bill picked up the eggs, Pete put on a helmet, Jim gave a speech, Frank built a boat, Harvey flipped the electric switch, Ted wrote the play. Okay, so let me get you to think then. So who picked up the eggs? Let's have a think. Does it jump to mind who picked up the eggs? What about
Bill?
Bill? Bill might have, yeah. Okay, what about, let me think, who walked on the roof? Okay, have a think about that. I mean, I want to show you another list now, right? And just sort of see if there's a difference between the first list and the second list. So Santa Claus walked on the roof, Easter Bunny picked up the eggs, Viking put on a helmet, JFK gave a speech, Noah built a boat, Edison flipped the electric switch, William Shakespeare wrote the play. So who walked on the roof? Of course, you know, when I ask this in the workshop, I get this chorus of, you know, 50 people all going, Santa Claus, and then who, you know, then the next one, you know, who picked up the eggs? The Easter Bunny. Now the thing is, if you go through that list, I bet you for each one you know the answer, right? And it's because the second list is a series of stories that we know well. Not only stories, but there are things that we've had events around, there's emotion attached to them, and we remember them explicitly. We know them so well. However, that first list is just a series of unconnected facts, right? Unfortunately, in organisations, we do the first list much more than we do the second list. And if you want people to remember things, you really have to help them know what the story is. What's the biggest story? People want to know the gist before they get the detail. And so that's what, you know, certainly the stories will actually help us do. So how do you go about remembering these stories? Well, this is my sort of like simple, called the organic method. Don't need to write anything down. It's really about engaging with the story in some way. So for example, when you find a story that you like, the first thing you should do is tell it to someone who can have a conversation about the story, right? So, for example, I did some work with the Victorian Bushfire Reconstruction and Recovery Authority, and I was involved in sort of helping run a big workshop. There was about 300 people. There was all the leaders who were affected by the fires. They had this thing called community recovery committees. And each community recovery committee had leaders, and they wanted to bring them all together so they could share what they were learning. You know, there was 33 of them. And Christine Nixon was the chairperson at the time, and she was kicking things off. And so, because it was all story-based what we were doing, I said to her, look, would it be great if you could tell a story to kick things off? And immediately she had one. She said, yep, I've got one. And she told me that about a week after the fires in 2009, OPSM, the guys who do the spectacles and whatnot, put caravans out in the fire-affected areas. And in this one particular area, this elderly couple walk up to the caravan, and the woman is complaining of like grit and dirt in her eyes. So they clean out her eyes and sort her all out. And then they turn to her elderly partner and say to him, so, is there anything we can help with you? And he said, well, no, I'm fine. She says, I'm actually legally blind because of diabetes, but nothing you can do about that. And they said, oh, so when was the last time you got checked up? I said, oh, 7 years ago. 7 years? And they said, 7? No, you can't be 7 years. You got to be checked up much more regularly than that. Things are changing, technology is changing, etc. Anyway, they're organising to go on to an ophthalmologist, goes to the ophthalmologist. Turns out there is a technique they can use that actually will bring a part of his sight back. So anyway, months later, he gets the operation. The guy gets a good chunk of his sight back. And as soon as I heard that, I had to ring my business partner. I told Mark, I said, Mark, I've got this story. So anyway, I'm telling the story. Now, here's the thing. You tell the story, and then you ask the question, so what does that story mean for you? And Mark said to me, well, what that story means to me is that even in the shittiest situations, good things can happen. And then he paused and then he said, you know what, it's also about how small things can make such a big difference. And so we had this bit of conversation, and what we're kind of doing is we're tagging the story, right? It's kind of these cerebral tags that you're creating. So what happens is 6 months later, you'll be in a conversation and someone will say, oh, yeah, but really, can a small thing make a big difference? And you'll go, well, actually, I was doing this work with, and you tell the story, right? The story will just pop out of thin air. It feels like magic, really. The story will come from nowhere and you'll have this story. Now, there's this one other thing you have to do, though. After the conversation, that helps you sort of tag the story. You then have to tell the story a few more times, right? I reckon once you've told it about 3 times, you can almost forget about it, and that story will pop up in the right context with the ability for you to choose whether you'll tell it or not, right? And that's the great thing about it. So that's the easy sort of organic way. Now, there are bits of stories which are hard to remember, of course, names and dates and event names, place names, those sort of things are hard. So you might have to jot those down. And I use a little product called Evernote, just a note-taking product. And it's great. I can tag up my stories. But here's the thing, never write your stories out. Right? Never write them out in full. Because if you do that, you start to believe you have to tell them that way, right? And oral storytelling allows you to expand the story or contract the story, or it's more about an improvisation. You get the story in your head and then you can improvise based on what's happening with your, with the audience that you're sharing that story with. So that's a little bit on memory. Sharing. Now, I just want to introduce you to a couple of story patterns. So these are types of stories you use for different situations. A connection story is great for when you meet people for the first time, and you want to share a story that gives people a little bit of an insight into who you are and what makes you tick. So like with this government department, I actually worked with this government department 15 years ago. So I told a little story from what happened 15 years ago. And all of a sudden, now they know, that audience is sitting there and they go, he knows a little bit about us, And I could have gone in and said, hey, I'm Shawn Callahan. I've worked in your organisation. I know a little bit about you, right? Now they're thinking I'm a wally, right? But by just sort of saying, I had this experience, it was kind of an interesting thing, and this happened and that happened, and then the leader said this, and they all laughed, right? And this is where the power comes from. They're inferring about me, not me telling them, right? So connection stories, just about anywhere you go and present, especially when they're new people, you should be sharing some story that gives people an insight that gives a bit of an insight into what makes you tick, what's your character, and secondly, why it just shows you that you're a little bit like them, right? Clarity story, we'll expand on this a little bit more in a moment, but it's about the story that helps you explain why, why you're doing something. Influence stories all about changing people's minds. So You know, if someone's hard on one particular view and you're trying to ratchet them over to another perspective, the worst thing you can do is to argue with them, right? Whereas you can share a couple of stories and it kind of just loosens them up because they start to see the weight of evidence might be in another direction, right? And then the success story is around taking case studies and turning them into, you know, sort of more human stories about what a person has done for another person as opposed to what an organisation has done for another organisation. So they're the just 4 patterns. There's actually many more patterns, but they're 4 that we teach quite often. And it all sits on the foundation of spotting stories. But let me just quickly take you through the clarity pattern and then I'll show you the last section. So the clarity pattern is just this basic structure. In the past, it was like this, and then something happened. So now we're doing this, you know, that's why we need to do this change. So in the future, it can be like that. And really, it's about telling this broad story, but then filling it with your own moments, your own personal experience. So you might sort of say, look, in the past, you know, we didn't change much. It was pretty straightforward. And then, of course, the global financial crisis hit, or a competitor came in from left field. And then you want to be able to tell your own moment. You need to be able to say something like, actually, I remember, you know, when Yui came on board. Now, that first ad, and this is kind of like the moments I hear from these insurance companies. Yui's causing them all sorts of pain. And so, you know, they can tell their personal experience of that. And then all of a sudden it becomes their story as opposed to this broad story that's been handed down from the organisation. Of course, in all of this, you have to have a point. You have to be very clear about why you're telling these stories. And I should say you should preface your point before you tell your story, right? Because if you do that, people then know what your story is about and they don't get anxious to think, why am I listening to this story? I like to just share this quote. Gary Klein, and by the way, Gary Klein is coming to Melbourne in the next couple of weeks. If you do a bit of Googling, you'll find where he's going to turn up. He's phenomenal. This guy is really the godfather of naturalistic decision-making. He's done lots of work all around the world, but he also has this real interest in intuition and insight. And I thought this was lovely. So to say, insight is an unexpected shift to a better story. Right? So that's what you're trying to do in change. You're trying to help people come to a better story, but you don't do it in such a way that you force it on them. They have to come to that better story, right? They have to work it out for themselves.
That kind of is a question I had, that when we're thinking about stories for managing change, are we thinking about the leader telling a story to get people to come with them, or a leader listening to stories to understand where the change should be going?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, I would say that there's at least 3 parts to that. One is the storytelling component, which we'll kind of focus on today, but you've picked up on the story listening side. That could be more powerful, right? The ability to ask questions to get stories to find out what's going on. And here's the trick with that. You want to ask questions that have when and where questions, as opposed to why questions. Never ask a why question. If you ask a why question, you get an opinion, right? But if you sort of say, oh, so tell me, when have you been surprised by something like that? And they'll go, well, you know what, 3 months ago, and then bam, they tell you a story. Of course, when and where, time and place, right? It's exactly the same concept. But the third element is story triggering, right? What can a leader do that will trigger stories in an organisation? And that's an untapped sort of space, because at the moment they're doing things that are triggering stories and they're not even aware they're triggering those stories. And they could be doing things which are working against them. How many initiatives have you seen that talk about collaboration and then the leaders don't collaborate, right? Or, you know, so, I mean, it's that type of thing that you have to build into. So a couple of tips. One is never mention the S word. And what I mean by that is the word story. Once you learn these techniques, actually using the word story doesn't help you. If you're standing in front of a group of colleagues and you start off by saying, guys, I just want to share a story with you, and the number of eye rolling you'll see, and, you know, people thinking, oh my God, we don't have time for that sort of thing, doesn't help you. Instead, you just jump straight into your story. You give them the point, you sort of say, you know what, small things can make a big difference. A few years back, and and they're sitting there going, okay, he's going to tell us about how small things make a big difference, or whatever the point you're making, and they will just pull it in. Stories are a pull strategy. They just go, really, what happened? In fact, that's your driving force. If you have a story where people are going, what happens next? That's what will push you to the end of that, that end of that information you're conveying. Another one, we've sort of touched on it, but the importance of moments, getting down to a small thing that actually happened. I was reminded of a little thing that happened to me years ago. Someone asked me why I love to create very beautiful things, because I love, I go out of my way to, get the best looking materials and I put effort into my slides and things like that. And I was thinking that it might have been when I was at first year uni, and we're talking about the 80s now, I got introduced to the mainframe computer. I never had anything to do with computers. I did a degree in geography and archaeology. And someone introduced me to the computer, and I could type up my essays, and they got printed out on this thing called a laser printer, right? And I've never seen a laser printer. It was in this big locked room, right? And you'd go in and be this strong smell of laser toner as you walked in, and these A4 sheets of paper would come out, and there's beautiful black print, with beautifully formed, it was just like a book, anyway, I'd hand in my essays, and I'm sure I was getting better marks than anyone else because I had this beautiful looking presentation. Of course, I suppose this content is important somewhere along the line. But see, that's a moment. Could you feel that? Could you smell that? Could you, sort of relive that with me? Right, that's what you're looking for, those tiny moments. Now, you don't want us to be in that moment for too long. You still have to jump up and tell the bigger story, but every now and then you have to jump in and tell these little moments. That's what people will remember. It'll be the big difference. So finally, to refresh, here's a couple of signs that you really do need another story. First one here is, of course, you've told it before. You've told it way too many times before. And, part of that can be because you've lost interest yourself, right? You're just sick of telling that story. And it comes through. It does come through. Now, sometimes also the context changes around you. So the story that was so good before all of a sudden loses its point. I remember being in America and I used to tell this story about Barack Obama and his storytelling abilities. And at the end of this, so I told it, right at the beginning, and everyone was very excited about it. Then I told it about 4 years later. Someone came up to me at the end of the workshop and she said, you should drop that Barack Obama. We're so disappointed because it was all about hope and, we're so disappointed that it hadn't sort of reached the heights that we were hoping for. So the context had changed. So I had to drop that story. And of course, you notice some stories will just lose impact over time. When you're moving to a new organisation, you really do need to have new stories. You've got to go out and find stories from the new organisation as opposed to your old one. And then also when you want to change your identity, like you're moving from this type of role to that type of role. You can't be telling your stories of your database development when you've just moved into software, sales or something like that. That's the book. That's where you can find out more about it, puttingstories-to-work.com. And really, that's all I've got for you. I know we've raced through quite a lot in 45 minutes, but feel free to get in contact, and I wish you well in your storytelling endeavours.
Thanks ever so much, Shawn. I've got loads of questions, but we're out of time, unfortunately. But thank you so much. It was very useful, very practical, but also very inspirational. So it was great to have you here. It was great that we weren't interrupted by it.
I know, it's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Time.
No alarms.
And thanks very much to you all for re-registering and being here with us today. And we look forward to welcoming you next time.